Hello everyone, welcome back. And this is the second video on scale construction. And as I have mentioned in the last video that we're going to talk about conceptualization in detail today. But before that, let me just respond to your comments on the smart shaming scale that you answered. I think you have pretty good insights about how the scale was developed. And so I want to summarize those points that were common from the comments that you left on our Google Classroom. Right, so most of you have observed that most of the statements in the smart shaming scale refer to negative behaviors or negative attitudes. And that's right. But that brings us to the definition of smart shaming. What is smart shaming? So if you do a quick Google search with smart shaming as the keyword, you'll find that it is mostly defined as an act of hostility or distrust towards individuals who are perceived to be intellectuals or smarter than you are. With that definition alone, we can say that indeed smart shaming is something negative. So that brings us back to the purpose of the scale. What are we trying to measure using the smart shaming scale? And so if you have answered the scale, you must have figured out that we're trying to find out how much of a smart shamer are you. And if we're using the same scale for research and ask a significant number of people to answer the same scale, then we can find out how prevalent smart shaming is among the people who belong in that population. So, Joey and Lexan, you're right. Because that's really the point of this scale. Because we're trying to measure how much of a smart shamer a person is, then it logically follows that the statements that we're going to include in the scale are those that reflect the behaviors or attitudes of smart shamers. But of course, I hear you guys when you say, but miss, the scale should include more positive statements because if not, the scale would be prone to social desirability bias. And you're absolutely right. And that's a risk because for sure, there are people who would answer the scale who might feel threatened or scared to answer truthfully because they know that they will get exposed if they indeed are resorting to smart shaming behaviors or actions. But yeah, unfortunately, that is one of the downsides of utilizing this kind of measurement tool. If you're using a self-report questionnaire or scale, then all you can do is hope or trust that your participant, your client, your patient, your test taker will be answering the scale as truthfully as possible. Because say for example, you're using a depression scale or an anxiety scale, you would notice that the statements included in these scales pertain to the symptoms of either depression or anxiety, which could be something negative. So when a person answers these kinds of scales, there's also that degree of uncertainty from the test user's end whether the test taker is actually answering truthfully because that would mean that that person would be admitting to manifesting these symptoms. So if you decide that you want to use this kind of measurement tool, you just have to be aware of these downsides. Which brings me to your second observation. And you're saying that you indeed noticed that there are statements pertaining to positive behaviors and attitudes that are scattered here and there throughout the scale. So these items are called reversed items because they are just the reverse of some of the items that are included in the scale. So that's why they seem to sound positive. Okay, and what are reversed items for? You know how when you answer scales or surveys and you know what they're trying to find out, and you answer the scale the same way, like all fives or all threes or all ones, just because you feel like it's so tedious to have to go through each of the items one by one. Okay, so these reversed items just make sure that your test taker, your client, your patient is reading everything thoroughly. Okay? So remember, your teacher evaluation would have those kinds of items so that you don't become too lenient in answering the scale by answering the same way all throughout. Okay, so that's why in the smart shaming scale, you'd notice that there are items that are reversed. Your third observation is about language. I asked you to answer the scale in Filipino, but we actually already have the English version. Cubier, Mejias, and Tejada did a great job translating the scale to English. And I think some of you have already answered the English version in the past for their data gathering. But I've also seen from your comments that most of you think that it is appropriate to use Filipino for the purpose of the scale. And you're right, because our intention is to administer the scale to the average Filipino because we want to see how prevalent smart shaming is among Filipinos in general. And we acknowledge that Filipinos may have different levels of understanding of the English language. And so originally the scale was in Filipino when it was first created, and we had to translate it to English to provide options. But I also understand where you're coming from when you say that the scale being in Filipino made it more difficult for you to answer because of the lack of familiarity with the Filipino language, especially since the words that were used were a bit more deep. So that brings us to that whole issue about language in test development. So we're going to talk about that some more as we move along in our discussion for this particular topic. And finally, I asked you about your thoughts about the necessity for coming up with this scale. And I really appreciate your contributions to the discussion on whether or not it is relevant to come up or to create the scale. I can see how most of you saw the need to create the smart shaming scale because of what you observe in the society today, especially on social media, when what we need right now is to have intellectual discussions about current events or social issues, but apparently seems like people tend to resort to mockery, shaming, bullying, attacking people's persons or personalities instead of sticking to the topic at hand. And that's basically what smart shaming is. And some of you have mentioned that by the creation of this scale, it would help people become more aware about their tendencies to smart shame others. And I guess that's also the reason why we had to come up with the scale when we first thought of creating this. This leads us to probably the most important question to be answered during the conceptualization stage of scale construction, which is there a need to develop a new scale? Take a moment to think about the reasons why we need to create a brand new scale. The obvious answer is that there is no existing scale that measures the variable that you would like to measure. Say for example, the smart shaming scale. When the idea to come up with a smart shaming scale first came about in around 2016, there wasn't any existing smart shaming scale yet, especially one that's created locally. But now, there's already one that was created by an undergraduate student in UP. But this one is centered more on online smart shaming behaviors, which is still different from the one that you answered, which is more general. So we can still argue for the relevance of this scale. But how about, say, for example, a well-being scale? A simple Google search will tell you that there are a lot of well-being scales. But why do developers still continue creating well-being scales when we already have existing ones? Well, for one, probably because well-being is such a broad concept and developers want to focus on just one facet of well-being, like meaningfulness in life. Or probably because they don't agree with the way well-being is defined in the existing scales. So there's a need to create one that agrees with their definition. So we have all those considerations also to think about. Probably the less obvious answer would be, while there are already existing scales that measure that variable that you want to measure, they may not be as psychometrically sound as we would like them to be. So we may want to attempt to create one that would be more reliable and more valid so that it could be useful for us. So by now, you're probably thinking why we need to justify creating a new scale so bad. Well, it probably sounds simple, but scale construction, test development is a long and arduous process that requires resources. So, time, obviously, effort on your part as the test developer, and money, because you need to have it undergo several iterations, several revisions, several test tryouts before you arrive at a version that is psychometrically sound. And of course, you don't want to waste all those resources if you already have an existing scale that will do its job for you. Alright, so moving on, the second thing that you have to think about in conceptualization would be the variable that you would like to measure. So since we are in psychology, this variable is a psychology-related variable. So it could be anything like a psychology concept or a social phenomenon if you're into social psych, or it could be attitude towards something or an interest. So it's up to you to choose whatever you want to create a scale on. But for the purpose of our final project, I will be giving you options so that you don't have to start from scratch. Okay. Anyway, so once you have identified what this variable is, you have to make sure that this variable is clear to you. Okay. So your understanding of this variable should be crystal clear, because if not, then it would be difficult to think of items that pertain to this variable. Okay, so it has to be clear to you so that you can also communicate what you want to say to your audience. Now, when you ask people to answer your scale, it would be clear to them as well. Okay. Another thing about it is that you have to be able to provide an operational definition. And what is an operational definition? This is different from a theoretical definition because an operational definition enables one to observe and measure this particular variable that you would like to measure. Okay? In providing an operational definition, we avoid confusion, especially if you're a group of researchers working on the same scale construction project. We have to make sure that everyone's on the same page. We know exactly what we're talking about and what we're trying to measure. So Say for example, smart shaming. Smart shaming may have slightly different theoretical definitions depending on who talked about it, but our empirical experience of what smart shaming is could be more or less the same. So if that's the case, if we're able to verbalize what that empirical experience of smart shaming is, then we can provide an operational definition of smart shaming. And we can be in agreement as to what exactly is this smart shaming concept that we would like to measure. The third thing that we ask would be, what is our objective for creating this scale? Yes, we want to measure something, but what for? What do we need this data for? There are actually two main answers to this. First is because we want to use the scale for research, and the second is for diagnosing. Most scales created in the undergraduate level are used in research. So these are the surveys that you ask your respondents to answer. And in using scales in research, you typically have the following objectives. It could be first to describe how that variable is manifested in a particular population. So let's take the example of the smart shaming scale. If I want to know how Gen Xers smart shame, then I might want to look at the ways that they answer the different items on the scale. So if the Gen Xers answer the same way on certain items, then I would have an idea that this probably is how they smart shame in their generation. And then I can compare it to how the Gen Zs would smart shame given the different ways that they answer the different items of the scale as well. The second objective when we're using scales in research is to quantitatively describe how much the population exudes or manifests that variable that is in question. So we're talking here about prevalence. But if we are creating a diagnostic scale, we are now shifting focus from getting the aggregate of scores from numerous respondents to just looking at the aggregate of responses of one individual. So our goals would also change. Okay, so the typical goals would be identifying who among the people that we have administered the scale to possess that variable the most, or classifying people depending on their levels. Fourth thing to consider would be the content of the scale or the extent of its coverage. Scales can be categorized as either unidimensional or multidimensional. Earlier, I gave the example of psychological well-being. Psychological well-being is a really broad concept and could be further broken down into different dimensions or facets. So, a psychological well-being scale can be considered a multidimensional scale because the items are created according to the different facets. Now, one of the facets of psychological well-being is purpose in life. And purpose in life is already a very focused concept. It's very narrowly focused and very specific, and we might have difficulty breaking it down into different dimensions. So, purpose in life scale, if you create one that would like to measure purpose in life specifically, then that scale could be considered a unidimensional scale because it's only composed of one dimension. Now, there are other considerations that we might consider minor, but are equally as important as the previous ones that we have already discussed. First would be, who will answer the scale? We have to always consider the background of our intended audience. So we might have to ask, what are their ages, what are their educational attainment, what or their cultural backgrounds, so that we would have an idea as to how the scale should look like. Even the language, no? Earlier we were talking about it. We should be able to know what the respondents would be more likely to understand, so that when we create the scale, we have that in mind. Another question is, how will the scale be administered? Will it be administered to a group or to an individual? Will it be administered online or in person? So again, this gives us an idea as to how we are supposed to create the questions. No? Even the length of the questionnaire, the scale, would be determined by the answers to these questions. So as you can see, even if we're still in the first stage, the conceptualization stage, we already have so many things to think about, and it can be very overwhelming. But don't worry, because you don't have to answer all of these questions off the top of your head. So this brings me to what we call the pilot study. So before even attempting to answer all of these questions, we need to conduct a pilot study. The pilot study is conducted even before you start with your scale construction project. So it gives you a clearer idea about the variable that you would like to measure. And it can be accomplished through different means. So your pilot study can involve an interview of the research subjects. So in smart shaming, you can either interview the smart shamers or the smart shamed, and ask them about the behaviors that they have observed, or they have encountered, or they have engaged in, that they consider as acts of smart shaming. In the construction of the smart shaming scale, the pilot study basically was conducted by asking the students from all the sections of psychological assessment about the acts of smart shaming that they have observed and or they have done in the past. Now, say for example, the research subjects are not accessible for whatever reason, like logistical problems or problems in scheduling, or for safety or security reasons, we don't know. We can also interview the people who know the research subjects. You can also interview experts. So, for example, with regards to the smart shaming topic, there may not be a lot of experts on that topic in the field of psychology, but it may be more commonly studied in the field of sociology, for example. So you may want to interview an expert who did extensive research on that variable that you would like to measure, so you get more information about whatever it is that you would like to create a scale on. Another thing that you can do is to observe in the natural or laboratory setting. Again, for smart shaming, social media is a great source of information. You can observe, especially now, interactions between people and see what kinds of behavior pertain to smart shaming. And finally, you can always rely on your good old literature review. So just search for articles that talk about your variable in question and try to understand what it is comprehensively. Look at the different meanings or different definitions of that variable, how it was explained from different points of view or different perspectives, and put them all together so you can answer the questions that we have posed in this discussion. Okay? So, having said that, your next exercise is to work with your group mates and look up articles about the topic that you would choose. Okay? So, what are these topics that I've been talking about but never told you about yet? So, finally, we've made it to the big reveal. In an attempt to be relevant, all of these topics are related to the pandemic situation. But if you can think of another topic that is along these lines, you can just propose them to me so I can approve it. Okay? So what are the topics? First, we have the COVID-19 coping scale. So essentially, this scale aims to measure how well people cope with the pandemic situation now. The second option is the COVID-19 perceived stress scale. Okay? So similarly, this measures how people perceive how stressed they are given the situation that we are in. And finally, we have the COVID-19 stigma scale, or how much people stigmatize individuals who have been diagnosed with COVID-19. Okay, so these are the three options, and you can choose which one to work on. And for our group exercise, I would like for you to search up the literature about that are related to the scales that I would like for you to work on. Okay, so for example, for the COVID-19 perceived stress scale, you can look at stress scales in general and the manifestations of stress among people who have lived through a pandemic. Okay, and then try to put them together, and so you can think about items related to perceived stress during a pandemic. Okay, but for now, I just want you to collect literature related to the topic that you will be choosing, and try to answer the questions that need to be asked in the conceptualization stage of scale construction. I will post in Google Classroom more specific guidelines on the output that you will be submitting in relation to this exercise. Okay, so I hope that you're able to get something out of this lecture, and I also would like to know how you are. So I posted a check-in question last Monday, and there's only one person who shared about how she is right now, so that's Joey. So thank you for answering. But if you feel like you would like to answer the questions more privately, you can also send me an email at missfaithmoral@gmail.com so that I know how you are. Okay? So again, stay safe, stay indoors, wash your hands, maintain distance, and stay healthy. Okay, that's it guys, and I'll see you on my next video. Bye!